All right. So, continuing this wonderful last week of the Men in Recovery series, I have had an opportunity to connect with some of the wonderful men of the Meadows, where I am honored to be one of their senior fellows. And I get to have behind the camera now my good friend, one of the reasons why I am a senior fellow, I've known for some time, but Sean Walsh, who is really one of the great leaders in the Meadows programming, and a really committed man for walking his talk, shall we say, which I find to be really important, which has been critical for me to make a decision to be connected to any program. But you reflect well that leadership. So thanks for joining me.
I appreciate that. Thanks, Dan.
Absolutely. So happy Recovery Month, Sean.
Yeah, happy Recovery Month.
So same question to start every conversation. What is the greatest gift that recovery has given you to help you be the man you always knew you could be?
It's a hard question because there's so many things that kind of flooded my mind when I first thought of it. But the biggest one that stands out in my initial response was faith and a type of spirituality. Before getting into recovery, I was pretty spiritually bankrupt, like I think most of us, and had no sense of faith or spirituality. And the biggest pivotal point in my sobriety was that third step. I doing my third step prayer was the first time I felt the presence of God, started to have a faith, and that helped me work through and all my issues and all my wreckage. And that you talk about the type of man that I knew I could be or wanted to be. I think I was probably still too insecure and had too much shame, but the biggest areas of me being a father and a husband really started from being able to have some type of faith. So I think that was the biggest for me is having faith and a sense of spirituality.
So, of course, one of the big sayings is faith without works is dead. And so you talk about being a father, you talk about being a husband, you talk about being an employee and what that means. How does faith give you the ability to be that best man that you can be? What's different about that faith that has given you that permission to be maybe a different man than you thought you would be?
Sure. I think the biggest part is in my relationship with, God and my higher power, how I view that, because I've never met my father. And I got a lot of, abandonment and kind of resentment and issues that kind of warped my idea of being a man and who I was. And it wasn't really, and still haven't met my dad to this day. My two biggest fears were being a husband and being a father. And I actually had told my wife when we started dating, I said, look, I'm not getting married. I'm not having kids. I had a little over a year sober when we started dating. And I was trying to follow the, no relationships, no big major life changes. But really told her that because I was terrified from it. I never had a good example of it. I had no idea how to be a husband, how to be a father. So kind of said, I know I'm screwed up enough that I don't want to screw up some kids. And I got no idea how to be a husband. And when I started to work through some of that, and had a proper understanding and relationship with God and faith in that, it helped me work through my kind of issues with my dad and that abandonment, and started to be able to get rid of some of that shame and understand that, it doesn't define me and I can be a good husband and a good father. So, it was really the starting point, and still is to this day, whether it's in a work situation or in, personal life and relationships.
So what does that look like for you? So the faith piece, I really understand that. And for me, having a faith in a higher power has really enabled me to stand up at times where I wouldn't necessarily have had the courage to do so, to allow for certain feelings and experiences to give myself more permission to have those or experience those. Can you talk a little bit about how that shifted for you, kind of, what we think of as being a man, whether it's a father or a husband, but maybe even as a leader, of a significant business. How does that show up?
I mean, it really looks like I view that as, he's my kind of employer, and I'm on, held accountable and responsible to trying to live my life by God's will. Again, that kind of third step, and seeking that on a daily basis, whether it's in work or home. And I think particularly in work, in a situation or being in a position of leadership or authority, there's a lot of fear and doubt and insecurities. And when I first had those opportunities kind of come about, I had, again, a lot of my kind of baggage come up and want me to either run away or have insecurities that I wasn't capable to do it. And just trusting and having faith that God's got me here for a reason, and if I'm a good steward and kind of do what the next right thing is in front of me, that He'll take care of me. And the reason I think been able to do that is because I've got 20 years of recovery and sobriety and faith that over time, that He's proven faithful, and that if I continue to kind of try to follow and live my will based on God's will for me and not mine, it usually ends up okay. And it doesn't mean it's always perfect, and it doesn't mean I may stumble across the way, but that's how I view faith, is that looking at my past experiences and seeing the opportunities where God's got me through it.
And you said something that I think was really powerful for men, right? So we all come into situations where we feel doubt and fear and insecurity, but those are not necessarily feelings that men are allowed to have. And so you come into a leadership position and you've got this opportunity and you've got these feelings coming up. And what I hear you saying is that the faith piece enables you to feel that, not let it define you, not let it define how you respond in that moment, but to feel it, as opposed to, I think, what a lot of men might do is deny that or use that as a reason to kind of tighten things down on control. So I'm feeling this doubt, I got to prove, I'm feeling this insecurity, I got to prove that I am the man. And so that fear kind of drives, a more hyper masculine response. Whereas like with this faith and the ability to do that differently, it's like, I'm here for a reason, and feeling this fear and this insecurity doesn't have to define me. But if I let it control my behavior, then chances are that's going to take me away from the man that I believe God wants me to be and the leader that I could be as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's totally it. I mean, it's that whole thing you always hear in recovery that, fear and faith, that we can't, have much faith when we're operating in fear, and to, really operate in faith means walking through those fears. And I think a lot of it comes down to having some identity, like you said, that's not tied up into appearances, material things, or positions, or some of the things that men we tend to struggle in, that I'm not defined by my position at any time, and having, kind of the security or the freedom to admit that I'm scared or that I'm insecure. Or, I know leaders that I've been impressed by, and men that at times have been in very public situations. Some of the most profound things I've heard them say is, I don't know, and I was wrong. And, just having that level of vulnerability and transparency isn't something I saw for most of my life. So when I see that from men in leadership, that's more impactful to me than the guys who are up there trying to pretend like they got it all together, because we know none of us have it all together.
Yeah. And what a great example of men in leadership to be able to do that. And it takes a lot of courage. I mean, some people don't necessarily recognize it, but it takes a lot of courage for a man in leadership or anyone in leadership to admit that and to express that level of vulnerability. And yet it usually always ends up fortifying their leadership.
Right. I agree.
Improving to be more effective. How about as a father? I mean, it's I can only imagine, what it's like then walking through this world, not having had a father. And then did you have a stepfather? Did you have a father figure in your life?
Later in my childhood, yeah. When I was like going into adolescence, I have an adoptive father.
Okay.
Stepfather for a while and then adopted.
Okay. And then, so now as a father of several children, and you've had quite a journey as a father,
right?
Talk a little bit about that.
That's probably, one of the most profound, beyond the marriage, because obviously that, was a big part of it. But, I was terrified of being a father. And, I think one of the biggest blessings that recovery's given me is the ability, and again, that I can have, I don't think it's pride, but I think esteem in the sense that I'm a good father. And one of the things that has been kind of the biggest takeaway, we have two biological daughters that we had, they're 12 and coming up on 9. And then about 2 years ago, we adopted 2 boys from Haiti. So I've got 4 kids now. And particularly when we went through the process of adoption, was a big shift for me, and profound in the sense that I spent most of my childhood kind of, without a father, and, struggles with kind of all the implications it has in your life. And to seek out and to have, this responsibility of fathering the fatherless or other orphan kids out there and being that role and being in their life, it's still, it hits me daily. I have daily reminders of kind of the burden, or not the burden, but the weight of that. And I'm in awe of it. If you would have told me 20 years ago that I'd have, let alone 1 kid, but 4, I would have laughed.
So that's such a great example of when we have faith, it seems that we kind of go where we're led, right? It's like you said, I'm here for a reason. God's got me here for a reason. So I need to honor that and then just pay attention to why. And so you've got, you had your idea about whether to be a father or not, but clearly the journey has brought you to a totally different place. You had your idea about being married or not. Clearly the journey has brought you to a different place. And so to me, it seems like that idea of faith, of having such a deep relationship with a higher power, it gives us the ability, the strength to go in that direction, but to do it in a way that's authentic for us. And doesn't have to be driven by some other design or some other expectation or expectations of others. And I really see you walking that and modeling that. You're not in a stress-free position at work. No. You have to navigate a lot of complexity. And on top of that, your children and your, as a husband and a spouse, that there's a lot there, but how I've seen you show up, there seems to be some real congruence across those different areas. And I think maybe that might be part of what we get the most, is that the lack of congruence usually is more emotionally driven and more from a lack of ability to be true to who we are in those situations.
Yeah, I agree.
And the faith kind of is that gift. So this series that we're doing, it's really kind of, it's been so fun for me because I've had a chance to have these conversations, and faith has come up multiple times. The relationship with the God, with a higher power, has been really important. So I always like my guests to have the last word on these interviews. So I just want to say, thank you again for being a part of this project. It's really been a treat and an honor to be a part of the Meadows family. And thank you. But for this interview, what I'd like you to do to close out is I'd like you to talk to the men like you 20 years ago. And what I mean by that is there's going to be young men who are going to be watching this, and they're going to be saying, but I don't want to be a father. That's great for him. I don't want to be a father, and I don't want to get married because I've seen what happens, and it's just not for me. I don't even want a relationship with a higher power. So in the spirit of ending on a note of encouragement for those coming up in the recovery journey, I just ask you to share some final thoughts in that regard.
I guess my final thoughts would be to be open. The whole reason, those guys in the 30s knew what they were doing, and those steps are in order for a reason. And the only reason that I was open was because I admitted that I was powerless. And when we figured out, well, let me speak for myself. When I figured out that I knew that my will, my choices, my desires, and my actions got me to the point of, a broken addict alcoholic who was at his end, the only option was for something greater. And that, there's sayings out there when people talk about, I thank God for all the answered prayers that were no. Just to not sell yourself short, to I have no ideas where I'll be 20 years from now. If you would have told me 20 years ago I'd be where I'm at today, I would have, never have dreamed. And there's, positives and negatives in there, but, to just be open to the process, to be willing to do the next right thing. I mean, that's what I look at, is trying to be a good steward and faithful and obedient to what I've got today. And usually tomorrow ends up okay if I do that. But while I can have goals to shoot for and to drive for, at the same time to hold things in the future loosely, because I don't know what my plans will be or what God's plans may be for me. But the only reason I'm open to it is because I know where my will, my thinking, and my choices get me.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Sean, so much for being a part of this, and happy Recovery Month.
Thanks.